Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nebraska Lecture. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. There's truly nothing quite like gathering in the Nebraska Union to celebrate the remarkable intellectual life of our university. But I'm so glad you are here, and I want to take a moment to share a few thoughts before you hear from one of our truly exceptional faculty members. The College of Architecture holds a very special place in my heart. My education and practice was as an architect and designer. I spent the better part of my career as a professor and later as dean of our College of Architecture. And in all that time, I came to affirm something deeply. The built environment is never just about buildings. The discipline and practice of architecture includes consideration of a plethora of social, cultural, environmental, technological, and aesthetic factors that together shape the built environment and influence human experience. It's about how we inhabit space, how we move through the world, and how the places we build shape who we are and how we relate to one another. A thoughtfully designed space can ease stress, inspire creativity, foster community, or offer dignity to those who might otherwise go without it. Architecture, at its best, is an act of care. That's what makes today's lecture so compelling to me. Professor Jeffrey Day is one of the most bold, imaginative, and rigorous architectural minds on our faculty, and his work consistently asks us to look more closely at the spaces we take for granted. His lecture, Housing, invites us to reconsider perhaps the most fundamental of all questions. What does it mean to create a place to live? What does it mean to house someone? What does it mean to build a home, not just a structure? These are not merely technical questions. They are profoundly human ones, touching on identity, belonging, memory, and meaning. And they are exactly the kinds of questions that the Nebraska Lecture Series exists to explore. This series reflects the very best of who we are at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, bringing faculty whose research and creative work impacts generations and pushes boundaries into open conversation with the broader public. It is scholarship made generous, made accessible, made alive. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for investing your afternoon in ideas that matter. I hope this lecture opens something new for you, perhaps a fresh way of seeing the spaces around you, or a deeper appreciation for the artistry and humanity embedded in the places we call home. Enjoy the lecture and go Big Red.
I'm Jen Nelson, Interim Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, and pleased to welcome all of you to the Spring 2026 Nebraska Lecture. This series highlights some of the university's finest researchers, scholars, artists, and thinkers. Today's lecture features Jeffrey L. Day, University of Nebraska-Lincoln Professor of Architecture. He is truly one of the nation's leading thinkers about how and where we live, and I am pleased to welcome him as today's Nebraska lecturer. Under his leadership, UNL's College of Architecture is doing some exciting work in partnership with communities and nonprofits to improve housing options that are both sustainable and more affordable. This is a great example of the real-world impact of UNL's research, scholarly, and creative endeavors, and an incredible learning opportunity for students. A little more about Professor Day. He received his A.B. from Harvard and his Master of Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. He's been at UNL for more than 25 years. He teaches design studios, seminars, and workshops that explore the intersection of design conceptualization and physical construction. He also directs FACT, an interdisciplinary design-build studio that engages nonprofits and communities in collaborations that span design and construction. He's a founding partner of Actual Architecture Company, a firm based in Omaha. He has received numerous awards, including a 2022 Residential Architect Design Award, the Plan Award in 2021, a Progressive Architecture Award in 2019, and dozens of national, regional, and state design awards. Also in 2019, Professor Day was elevated to fellowship in the American Institute of Architects, the highest membership honor in the organization, which is bestowed on only 3% of member architects. Additionally, his work has been featured in numerous art exhibits across the US. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our partners who helped to bring these lectures: the Office of the Chancellor, the Research Council, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Please stay with us after the lecture for a Q&A session and for a reception across the hallway. And now please join me in welcoming Jeffrey L. Day.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you. Thanks, Jen, and thank you to Interim Chancellor Kathy Ankerson, our former Dean, the College of Architecture. It's great to see you on the screen, and really wonderful words. I also want to thank the Dean of the College of Architecture, Kevin Vandenwy-Mellenberg, Architecture Program Director David Carley, both are here, and my wonderful colleagues for all of their support. None of the work that I'm going to show today, especially none of the work with students, could be done without all of these people, including our students at the College of Architecture, who contribute so much to everything that I've been able to work on. Let me grab my glasses before I hit my microphone. I founded Actual Architecture Company, which is based in Omaha. I used to be partner in a company called Minday in San Francisco and Omaha, and restructured that as Actual Architecture with the goal of well, I named it really with three goals. One, I did not want to name the architecture firm based after my own name, because I think the architecture is a collective act that is always engaging many, many people in different capacities to realize the work. But also I wanted the name to articulate an idea that we think about, or our practice is really about the possibilities of buildings as ideas. And then finally, to communicate our belief that architecture is an act, not a thing. It also sounds good with fact, so actual fact makes me laugh. And then Jason Griffith, my colleague, has a design build studio called Plane, and so we love to mess around and work together and find synergies between our names and also do good work. I also want to thank my business partner, Ashley Byers, my former business partner, E.B. Min. Some of the work is their responsibility as well. Longtime associate Dennis Krimusa, who's been involved in both of my practices for over 10 years. And then numerous other collaborators who've worked with us, and of course the students in the FACT Design Build Studio, who have been working diligently on a lot of very important work here and outside of Lincoln as well. So we work on many different kinds of buildings, but today I want to talk about houses, how we think about them, how we design them, and how they represent the act of living. And I want to begin with a question: why won't Americans accept the promises of social housing? This is a question that's bothered me for most of my career, and responses to this often assume that the issue is about access to housing relative to financial, social barriers, and then urban planning problems, potentially a problem of misaligned policy. But we argue it's also a cultural problem, a misalignment between the mindset, imagination, and desire for places to live with other people. So housing, spelled normally here, is often conflated with multifamily projects, such as the image on the screen, where the individual dwelling unit is subsumed within a collective whole. This image is an ongoing project in our office that combines apartments ranging from studios to 1 and 2 bedrooms to 3 bedrooms. Some of the units are 1 story, some are 2 stories. But none of the units is identifiable in the image of the building as one sees it from the street. Like many multifamily projects, maybe most multifamily projects, the articulations of the building may attempt to adjust to perceptions of scale, but they really correlate to the individual home within them. And sometimes these articulations are due to planning restrictions, urban design guidelines, and so on. But we aren't seeing the home, we're seeing the collective. And I think this is a challenge for a lot of Americans who still have a desire for the single-family house. So in 2011, to address this problem and approach the broader challenges of housing, an interdisciplinary group of faculty at Columbia University wrote the Boyle hypothesis. This is a research project proposing that post-foreclosure American suburbs should be redeveloped by viewing housing as a public infrastructure rather than as individual market-driven property. And this report led to an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Architecture the next year, Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. So at its most basic, the Boyle hypothesis claims that if you change the American dream, you change the city. The single-family house in the city or the suburb in which it's situated share a common destiny. Hence, change the narratives guiding suburban housing and the priorities they imply, including spatial arrangements, ownership patterns, the balance between public and private interests, and the mixtures of activities and services that any town or any city entails, and you begin the process of redirecting suburban sprawl. This amounts to a reformulation, if not a complete repudiation, of what is sometimes called the American dream. Our work in the Actual Architecture Company and through FACT seeks a middle ground. We seek to work between and around existing structures, creating subtle shifts in cultural desires around the house, and we work with the house as part of an attainable housing strategy itself. This begins with the belief that the act of making a house is an act of living. The Boyle hypothesis, which is actually written as a Socratic dialogue in the form of a film script, it's very interesting to read, states that this is a story about how we live today. It's about how we imagine the way we live, about how we represent that to ourselves, and how we feel about those representations and how we act upon them. So there's a long history in architecture of architects using houses as a place to experiment in design. It's often a place where young architects prove themselves and establish new agendas. This is Robert Venturi's Vanna Venturi House from 1964, which is a harbinger of postmodernism in architecture. It's also a house he designed for his mother. In 1978, Frank Gehry, who passed away at age 96 in December, shifted his office. He founded his private practice in 1962, but it really worked a lot in development projects, doing good work, but not any really well-distinguished work. Then in 1978, he actually fired his whole office, started over, and really kind of reoriented his practice around the ways of working that he'd learned from his friends who are mostly artists. And also based on his deep understanding of how buildings are built, and this is in Los Angeles, with ordinary materials and ordinary construction methods. And this is the building that established him as a leading architect and launched the rest of his career. But rather than think about houses as an object of cultural expression, which is really what the first two projects I just showed, what they do, we prefer to think of actions rather than things. And this image is from sculptor Richard Serra's famous verb list, which is his attempt to reformulate his art practice around terms of action rather than form. Actions, he writes, divorce making from metaphor and easy imagery. And we say this shift we say this is a shift from what an object means and what it means as being what's important about it to what it actually does as an artifact in the world. So you could think of the act of making a housing as to house, to make a house. And this is an act of living. And the story about the house in the Americas, at least, begins with a history of settlement. Relative to housing, the American dream correlates with the narrative of expansion and settlement from east to west, moving from the east to the west. Of course, this is in complete ignorance of the people who already lived on the land. And to use a contemporary terminology, the way we think about building houses is building on greenfield development spaces, like open land, farmland becomes housing, and that's the suburban environment that seems to be the desire for many people. Landscape historian J.B. Jackson's 1953 essay, The Westward Moving House, traces the development of the American home as the fitful evolution of the house from a device to tame a fearful wilderness to a transformable and fungible commodity. He starts by describing the colonial house in New England, a house that follows the English model, 16-foot wide bay structures, the basic dimension of this house, which is wide enough to fit 2 teams of oxen. In America, this was modified to the extent that almost every dimension in the colonial house was divisible by 8, or half a bay. And he defines the town, most interestingly, surrounding this house as a superfamily, like the highest stage in the domestic hierarchy rather than the smallest unit of a nation. I think that's a very interesting idea, to think of the town as a kind of large house. He writes that the whole house exists not to create something new, but to transform 4 separate individuals, this is of course a nuclear family, into a group, though only for a few hours at a time when they gather in the social spaces of the home. The house is a transformer. It serves as a functional machine and the center of family life and cultural memory. Jackson describes the 1900s Great Plains house as a house with a flexible plan, a house designed so sensibly that it could be used by one family and then sold to another, or in the case of this house that we bought at Art Farm for $400 and moved it to Art Farm to become an artist residency space. The story of the house can be written in advance, but it is lived in ways that are unpredictable and unattainable to designers. The house is a machine, like others on the farm, ready to be repaired, modified, moved, or repurposed as needed. In writing an update to J.B. Jackson's evolutionary story, David Heyman, who's a professor at UT Austin, states that Jackson uses this westward movement to document changes in the value and nature of land, from a source of connection to a foreboding cosmic order, to an optimistic and limitless physical commodity, and to a disconnected and transformable economical value in each case of the landscapes he describes. This project here, just briefly to describe it, is we bought the house, moved it to Art Farm, working with the students, in fact, started to convert this as a space for artists, particularly writers. There are other buildings at Art Farm that function as art studios for painters and sculptors and conceptual artists, but this is really a place for writers to gather and to sort of observe the land and to work on their projects in a very challenging environment. So jumping very quickly here, Le Corbusier, one of the most famous architects of the 20th century, wrote that a house is a machine for living in, but it is also a device for framing the relationship between people, buildings, and landscape. The cartoon here on the right is, I think, one of the most important works of architectural history. This is a Mexican cartoon from the 1960s about the life of Le Corbusier. Very interesting and full of action, maybe action that didn't really exist, but it's fun to read. And in this, the client is asking Le Corbusier to design him a house that is open to the garden, but that doesn't obscure the landscape. The result is Villa Savoye, one of the most famous houses from the early third of the 20th century. And Le Corbusier didn't just design a house to work with the landscape, he changed the fundamental relationship of architecture and landscape, lifting the garden to the roof and opening all the walls to the surrounding landscape with a ribbon window. At the end of this passage in the history here in the comic book, the client says, "Well, where's the facade?" And Le Corbusier says, "It's all facade," which I think you could read in multiple ways. But so ultimately, Le Corbusier reduced living in a house and the life of a house to a sort of discrete set of mechanistic techniques that he called the 5 points. And architectural history can take it from there. I'm not going to spend time on that. But these experiments to imagine the house not as an artifact stuck in history and psychology, but as a response to new ways of living and the current demands of society taken head on. These are more interesting to us, I think, in the sense of how the house is changing over time. In the 1940s, Austrian-American architect Friedrich Kiesler argued that Le Corbusier's functionalist manifesto towards a new architecture, in which he claims the house is a machine for living in, He claimed that that served as an important guide for architects between the First and Second World Wars, but that a new manifesto was needed after the Second World War. He argued that it's a fact of growing importance that the house of the family is not only a machine for living, as Le Corbusier put it, but it is also a nervous system. Kiesler's Endless House, seen here in a model commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art, is a synthesis of his approach through art and architecture, and the most concrete example of his theory of co-realism that merges three environments, the natural, the human, and the technical, towards an architecture based on the cyclical nature of human life. Kiesler worked on this project for 40 years in fits and starts, but never got beyond this model that you see here. He was actually commissioned by MoMA to build a full-scale version in the courtyard of MoMA, but couldn't get himself together enough to do that. So this is all we have, are images of this model. So some of our own work takes a rather different approach. So rather than thinking about this as a holistic kind of way of merging life, we actually took a project here, we called it Hexad, and pushed in the opposite direction towards a kind of extreme functionalism. This is actually an art/architecture commission that remains unbuilt at this point, where we used a pure form to examine a kind of siteless architecture that takes the Jefferson Grid as the site itself. So settlement, as we know, depends on an infrastructure and an ideological attempt at organizing territory, wiping out what existed before and establishing a new order. Our project asks, what would a house that followed the now obsolete rules of the Jefferson Grid actually look like? So the grid that we live in is based on a series of obsolete measuring devices. The pole, 16 foot 6 inches, which of course is the dimension of 2 oxen in your house. That relates to an acre, which is the size of space that an ox can plow in a day. And then that compiles to 640 acres in a section, which is the 1 mile grid that we see from the air and on the ground. And not to spend too much time on this, but it is worth noting that about 75% of the continental US is based on the stamina of 18th century oxen. Odd to think about that, but when you drive down county roads, think about what you're driving through. So this project is located on the edge of Lincoln, and of course Lincoln is a city dominated by the public land survey system. As you look at Lincoln, you can see here in the red grid the series of section lines, highways and other things overlaying upon those. As you zoom in, you can start to see the sort of interplay of different organizational systems. The original grid defining settlement in the older parts of Lincoln, and then suburban development that ignores almost completely the vertices of the grid. Our site was on a property, a large property outside at the edge of Lincoln by the interchange, 80 to 180 interchange. A residence established there and a building designed by the historicist architect Dimitri Porphyrios that also has a miniature grid within it. And we were commissioned to design a residence for a caretaker that would also act as a part of the sculpture garden. So trying to find a form that works, a three-dimensional form that works with the grid, just as rational, just as unforgiving. We finally settled upon this, which is a tetrahemi-hexachron for any geometry fans. A pure form that allowed us to think about the pure inhabitation of limitless space here. The client wanted to build this out of shipping containers, so we sought a way to combine containers together into a form more or less like the pure form of the tetrahemi-hexachron, and then started to divide the living spaces into the various sort of vertices of this as they extend out into the landscape. And the hyper-rationalization of the building sort of leads to a hyper-rationalization of how one lives in a house, so dividing functions into pure spaces, the living, the bathing, the eating, sleeping, and so on. Also made me think about Georges Perec's Species of Spaces, if any of you have read this, where he argues that maybe we should start naming our rooms after other things such as senses, so the seeery or the smellery or the tastery and so on. Or days of the week, which today we'd be in the Tuesdayery, but UNL can't afford that many lecture halls, so we have the everydayery here. But Perec also argues for useless rooms that would not be not only rooms that have no precise function or multi-purpose rooms as we call them today, but entirely afunctional spaces. So in this project, the territorial axes of the tetrahemihexachron are divided into the eating and living spaces here, or in this side, the sleeping and bathing opposite one another. And then in the center is this uninhabitable space with a grid that's just a grating, so you really can't do anything on it. And it's a space without use, as the Dutch architect and situationist Constant would say, a coincidence room. Finally, we've got the two vertical spaces in the vertical axis, the subterranean and the aerial space for viewing and dreaming above, and space for reading and contemplation below. However, most of our work is actually not that speculative or visionary, but actually based in straightforward pragmatism that believes that getting it right is just as important as getting it done. So in much of our work, we do a lot of custom homes. We work on projects that enjoy very dynamic landscapes, such as this Wanaka Wedge House in Wanaka in the South Island of New Zealand. It's kind of there where the arrow is, facing the Southern Alps. And not just by chance, I happened to grow up in this town of Christchurch for part of my youth, so about 5 hours away by car. So it's familiar territory in some ways. The house sits in a former sheep station that's now being restored to a more or less native landscape eventually. The house has views. Every room has a unique view to this landscape looking out at the Southern Alps. In fact, there are a lot of, right in the foreground here is a Lord of the Rings site. They're kind of all over the place, and nowadays all tourists end up just doing that, going to Lord of the Rings sites in New Zealand. But they are beautiful places, and some of them are hard to get to. And the house just sits almost perfectly aligned with the ridge behind it. So this line kind of from the ridge kind of forms the roof line, allows the house to kind of be dynamic in its form, but sit in the landscape and fit quite well. And that was a part of the way of getting this through planning. However, this house was not designed for New Zealand. It was actually a house I designed for my mother in Maine. We designed the house for a property that my mom purchased. She thought she would make lots of money by selling her existing house, building a new house. Ultimately, I convinced her there's just a losing proposition, and so we didn't build the new house. But we had this design, and we were commissioned to make it a house plan set for sale on a website called Hometa. We made a few modifications, but ultimately, basically, the house is what we designed for Maine. It's really a simple dwelling that divides spaces into two basic categories. There's the level of living on the ground floor, living room and dining area, and master or main bedroom, and then two other bedrooms on the upper level. So a smaller program upstairs, a larger one below, and this sort of ribbon-like spatial divider, in the case of the house being in wood, sort of wraps those spaces and defines them very clearly. Just because you think architecture is expensive, there is a free download for a gingerbread house version of this, if you happen to want this. So think about this at holiday time next year, or later this year. I haven't actually made it, but it seems fairly straightforward. So the original wedge house, if you think of it as a ready-made, then in the sense of Marcel Duchamp's work, the Wanaka wedge house is an already made. It's like a remaking of a ready-made. An instance fitted to a specific landscape, and in this case, our role as the designer is not to design something new, but to take the existing already made and fit it and adjust it and edit it to work on this site. So we did make some changes. We made it a couple of feet longer, dealt with orientation, of course, and the roof height in order to meet planning codes and other rules. We also changed all the materials. It's built in an entirely different way, based on New Zealand construction systems and using the New Zealand vernacular of painted corrugated steel, and then interior spaces that all open up into the landscape in very interesting and different ways, highlighting sort of close moments as well as those in the distance. The top and the bottom of the wedge become really different environments despite the rigid form of the building itself. You have the high piece facing up to the ridge. The low end of the project merges into the landscape at a rock where we sited the house in a very peculiar way. And then it just sort of dies into a beautiful garden and protects from the wind and creates an outdoor space for the two residents. But the severity of the form is maintained from the very sort of tip at the bottom to the very top, and it's very unrelenting in its form. However, the windows and the fenestration, as we call it in architecture world, are much more chaotic. They don't conform to the geometry of the building as much as to the way we live inside it. So the windows alternate between views and sort of ventilation functions, solar functions, and so on, and are defined by the interior spaces of the house. It faces northwest towards the Southern Alps into the valley with the Lake of Wanaka off in the distance. And then as you can see in this section image, there's the double height space with the living room kind of in the middle, and then a space with 2 bedrooms above, a bathroom above the kitchen and dining area, and then the main bedroom on the other end facing the garden. The spaces are conformed to the geometry of the house and then are alternated between the 2 levels at this end with this wrapping kind of wood surface that curls around the space, allowing one of the rooms up above to open to the space below, and then to articulate a kind of a connection between upper spaces and lower spaces in a very simple linear hallway that runs the length of the house. The materials on the interior, the concrete floor has pebbles from the Clutha River down in the valley, and it's ground so that those are exposed almost like a terrazzo. They have a really nice collection of contemporary New Zealand artists, so we worked around some of those artists to think about how that work would be displayed in the house. And then the wood that you saw throughout all these images is eucalyptus from a farm in Canterbury, a few hours away, custom milled to wrap these curves and fit the house. For any assistant professors in the room, the wood is actually a retirement project created by a sociology professor in New Zealand who, when he was an assistant professor, planted a eucalyptus tree farm. And then when he retired from teaching as a full professor, he harvested the lumber and he mills it and sells it to people. So if you're thinking about your next path as a professor at the university, start planting. The clients for this are professional musicians. One is a violinist who works around the world and is in a Christchurch Symphony Orchestra as the lead violinist and concertmaster. And then the other is a conductor who is the conductor of an orchestra in Wellington, New Zealand, and one in California. So he's kind of back and forth between there. And then they have a very compliant and photogenic cat who shows up in lots of images. So what makes a house a housing? A house is an object, of course, and housing is often thought of as the societal need for a place to live. A house becomes housing when it moves from being a singular physical structure to a collective functional system that provides dwelling for a community often influenced by economics, policy, and social needs. So back to New Zealand. We've been very interested in small-scale infill projects that start to densify neighborhoods which once were single-family dwelling neighborhoods, and to add density but without changing the ultimate scale of the dwelling unit. So we're not talking about a large apartment block kind of placed in a neighborhood, but dense constructions of essentially single-family dwellings. This is a 1965 infill housing unit by Miles Warren of Warren & Mani, a Christchurch, New Zealand architecture firm, using at the time very straightforward materials. It's 4 flats. One of the flats is 50% bigger, so it has a half of a gable, adding space to the one on the far left. Using unpainted concrete blocks, the 45-degree pitch roof allows the blocks to be cut very straightforwardly and used as edges on edge at the top to kind of create the roof edge. Again, corrugated metal on the roof, and then simple painted joinery in a few details at the entries. You can see the entry there. And as we move inside, there's an almost fanatical attention to detail, using clear sealed wood and white painted paneling. And in this case, carpeted floor, but I think there's concrete underneath. And then a real generosity of space. And this is something that really inspired me for some other work that I'll show in a moment, to think about how the small house can become something more generous by having a dignified, voluminous space on the interior. And so here we're seeing the large living space in this, very small. This is the 2-bedroom. The others are all 1-bedrooms in this development, and then they all have gardens. So it's really about an indoor-outdoor environment and living in a small place with a lot of space. So the distance from the capital A architecture here of Villa Savoye to a house that is community-based is not really that far. This is Le Corbusier's Gardener's Lodge. Anyone who's been to the Villa Savoye knows that there's actually an ADU at the Villa Savoye. Everyone talks about ADUs, but this is nothing new. There's a Gardener's Lodge that uses the same techniques, but it's only a 30 square meter residence, very small. But it has the same 5 points, so it's lifted up, roof garden, so on and so forth, ribbon windows, all the things you'd see in the larger version of this. And it's a way of scaling down the residence, but thinking about it very differently in terms of what happens. So we argue that when you scale down a house to build a small house, things have to fundamentally change. You can't just take the suburban 2,000 square foot house and reduce it to 800 square feet and have the exact same arrangements of space. We've become really interested in this kind of dwelling possibility in Omaha. We entered a competition a couple of years ago for an ADU in Omaha. Omaha is starting to create a set of house plans available to all, and we contributed one that is an aging-ready, accessible dwelling, but fits the rules for Omaha's ADU rules, which are complicated sort of planning rules, but nonetheless very generous for people to be able to build backyard cottages. But we're also working on other kinds of infill housing. This is called Duplex Plus, which is another competition that we won, in this case for rethinking the duplex in Omaha. And again, the city is hoping to make these plans available as pre-approved designs for people to use. It's aging ready, so it's really thinking about what happens when people get older and what are their needs. AARP has a very kind of clear set of guidelines to help designers and residents think about what they need. But beyond that aspect, we were really interested in taking this sort of understanding of a duplex, which is usually a thinking of like a mirror image of two houses that have nothing to do with one another, and think about it as being something that has differentiation within it, to think about the different people and how they actually inhabit the space. So we came up with something that has 3 fundamental units, if you forget the garage. There's a 3-bedroom dwelling, an age-friendly 1-bedroom dwelling, and then a shared flex room. But I think what's really interesting about this project is the different ways that one can put this together. So you could have, a multi-generational home where it's a single family. You could have, parents living here, family here, grandparents down here, guests, so on. You could have all 3 being separate. So you could have, actually that's this one here. So you could have a house for a family. You could have an ADU that has its own entrance, and you could have aging-ready residents here, and then you could have various mixes of those where you could have a caretaker taking this and working with the person or people who live in here, and a separate family here, or this unit could take that over and an older person could live here and then a younger family here. So it could be used in many different ways, and we accomplished this through a device we kind of think of as the Duchamp door, borrowed from Marcel Duchamp, whose apartment in Paris had a door that either closed a bathroom or a kitchen from a living space. And for the Duchamp, the interest here is that the door is always closed and always open at all times. But for us, it was really a way of thinking about how do we open these different spaces to one another and allow them to work in a sort of multifunctional way to tune the house for whoever happens to be living there. So the door exists kind of here, and it's actually a double door, so you can close one, open these 2, you could open these 2 to one another. You can open it different ways, or you can fold the doors away entirely and allow people to live in this house in a very flexible way with access to the outdoors and so on. And it's designed to fit in Omaha zoning for duplexes on the lots that are sizable enough to allow for duplexes, but working with the setbacks, adjacencies, and all the things you'd find on a typical lot in Omaha. If you have an alley, you could have access for parking from the alley, but there's also room to have a driveway along the front. So rethinking the house has been part of our work for a long time. It's also been part of the FACT studio for a number of years. And during the pandemic, we worked on a project called the New Attainable House that culminated in an exhibition at the Nebraska History Museum, and then a catalog that we've published to document that work and to share it more broadly. This was a follow-up to an exhibition called Evicted by Matthew Desmond and the Evicted Center at Princeton University. It was a traveling exhibition. So we used the same language of that exhibition to design the exhibition that we created from the studio. But it's socially distanced design build because all the models are set about 6 feet apart from each other so that people could go through. They only let 5 people in the gallery at a time, and they had to kind of stay their distance. We have 6 different projects, so people could kind of move around and see the projects as they needed to in a safe way. The project emerged as a collaboration between the FACT studio, which was an architecture master's studio at that time, and the planning studio, working with Frank Ordia, who is teaching that studio to community and regional planning students. We worked together and we formed teams of architecture students with a planning student, and each team worked with a different community design center or nonprofit developer in Lincoln and Omaha. And each of those developers came with a series of requirements and interests, and then each team worked on redefining what the house would mean within their interests. So for NeighborWorks Lincoln, we worked on a double lot merged to create a cluster housing development, in this case 5 houses plus a parking off an alley, using an interesting mechanism that NeighborWorks was pioneering in Lincoln, the Community Land Trust, where the land is held in common in a trust while the houses can be sold individually. And what's really wonderful about a community land trust, not only does it reduce the cost of the house to the purchaser because they're not buying the land, but when they sell the house, they can realize appreciated value of the house itself, but they're required to sell the house to someone who has the same economic situation as the development is set up for. So say they have to sell to people between 80 or 120% of area median income, even if they own a house for 20 years, they still have to sell to somebody within that demographic. And that maintains the affordability of the house or the land over time, and it prevents speculation or gentrification from taking an affordable house out of the world of affordable housing. But it also allowed us to create things such as shared outdoor spaces like this gathering area here and gardens and so on between the houses that everyone would get to enjoy because the land is maintained in common. But one of the other goals of this was to think about how developments like this could fit into existing neighborhoods without fundamentally changing their character. And so this project achieves that through scale, but then I guess sort of the vaguely familiar qualities of the form of the houses, while borrowing from maybe the more vibrant colors that one sees in the neighborhood. And then that brings me to the last project I'm going to show today, and this is a project we call Our Story. It's an initiative we started a couple of years ago, working with Partners for Livable Omaha, run by Jessica Sherman in Omaha, who's been a collaborator on a few different FACT projects. And this is an attempt to design small, aging-friendly homes for infill lots in Omaha. So generally, if you think about houses in the United States, this gets back to this American dream issue. The typical American house is 2,100 square feet, and the first 2 Our Story houses are 802 and 618 square feet. And so to achieve this, we had to think about this idea of compressing the house and fundamentally changing it to work at those small scales. This is the cohort of students who began the design phase of this project in 2024. All of them continued into 2025 with some additional students. I don't have an image of the spring semester, but it's just a few more people. And we worked through, and this is typical of most FACT studios, we work through large-scale models and full-scale mock-ups that are full-scale chunks of buildings to allow us to test the building systems. And then working in Innovation Studio here at UNL, we self-perform certain tasks that would become incorporated into the work. The studio ethos has been this statement here, that attainable housing occurs at the intersection of policy, finance, and design. We believe that we can't really solve the housing crisis by dealing with one of these issues and not the others. So we can design great things, but if we're not thinking about how those great houses are financed or how they conform to policy and work with local jurisdictions, we're not going to solve many problems. And so similar to design thinking, like design thinking is a way of using design to solve problems. The three core requirements of design thinking are desirability, feasibility, and viability. And no innovative project is really going to be successful unless it addresses all of those areas. I would add to that responsibility, thinking about the ethical and social issues and around whatever the project might be. So the Our Story houses are designed for a 60 to 120% area median income range, which is essentially middle income workforce housing, and that's fundamentally where the funding came from for this project through Spark. It's ultimately state funding from the Middle Income Workforce Housing Investment Fund. We originally started with a property we secured in Benson in Omaha. The sort of gray square would be what we could build by right without having any variances or conditional use permits. But the city actually convinced us to split the lot in two and build two houses, which would increase our density here by two in a small neighborhood. But it also allowed us to really lean into the idea of the small house, the small lot, and the idea of shared sort of legacy within the city. We went through a process that ultimately required a city council vote. The city council was very enthusiastic and approved it unanimously. And these houses are now under construction, hopefully to be occupied by August this year. So these are the first two houses in renderings produced by the students. And we're thinking of these now as a system of houses that we could use in multiple futures. So thinking about houses as systems is not new. And there are a lot of examples of prefabricated housing systems. I'm going to show one of them here, which is the Lustron House. This was a company formed, like with many others after World War II, to repurpose military production facilities for housing, with the great need for housing after people returned from the war and started families. Lustron sought to build houses using everything built in the factory, but using sort of industrialized systems. It's all panelized. It's made out of steel and enamel and a series of components. The house plans are about 1,000 square feet for most of them. There were a few variations. One of the things that we thought was interesting about these, which inspired us in the Our Story project, was that the cabinetry or storage units of the house are built like movable boxes, but then placed as dividers. So they actually take the place of walls. And that's something, this is one of the plans from one of our houses, that the kitchen and bathroom and then the storage is all consolidated in these two blocks. And that's the only way that interior spaces are subdivided through that fabrication system. So Lustron houses were 100% factory made. They had about 11 to 13 tons of steel, about 1 ton of enamel, and about 3,300 prefabricated parts. Everything built in the same factory. They intended to sort of roll these out, but of course tooling up and setting up the factory took a long time. Costs soared, and they only produced about 2,700 houses before going bankrupt 2 years later in 1950, despite the huge demand for housing. People do like to collect these houses, so there are maybe 1,500 left in the country in various places. So the failure, which was very direct, had a lot to do with the high upfront cost. That everything had to be sort of pre-paid to build the factory and so on. They had technical problems like marriage walls between parts weren't matching. The United States is sort of a agglomeration of non-standard building codes. Building codes are local, so every jurisdiction has slight variations, so it's very hard to build something that can go everywhere. And then the fact that they're all proprietary systems. Every single thing in this house had to come from Lustron. There was no other possibility. So they essentially lost out because of poor planning and the vertical integration of the industry. Other developers like Levitt and Sons, the Levittown housing production company, perfected a different category of mass production on site using more standard fabrication techniques Still some prefabrication, but not a lot. And they were able to speed up construction, but also to work with existing workforces and skills without having to kind of be so specialized. And that sort of inspired how our story works. And we think of these houses as a kind of prefabrication, but none of the parts in these projects are proprietary. We have structural insulated panels, which is like a sandwich panel of foam and oriented strand board for the walls and roof. And that's a standardized system that can be built by many different companies. There are many companies around the country. The prefabricated storage units are basic cabinetry. In this case, the students built them, but they could be built by others. And then the prefab kitchen bath wet wall, we call it, a 10-foot wall that is kitchen and bathroom, all the utilities in that one piece, could be built, again, by almost anybody. And so part of the goal of this project was to think about workforce development. And so Jessica is working on strategies for getting local folks to start building these projects. So this is just an example of how this system could be applied to a wide range of different house types. So you've got, the basic units. The window is a sort of add-on, like a bay window. It doesn't have to be there, but it could. But then different configurations of storage wall allow this to configure to different forms of houses, different sizes. The kitchen and the bathroom never changes. It might mirror image, but it never changes its dimensions. And so then the interior becomes a very straightforward set of these pieces as an aesthetic that becomes the infrastructure for living, and then it has people's things. So there's the cabinetry, which could come in many different colors. The kitchen, we made it all black so we could merge it with appliances. And then the polished concrete floors is sort of an upgrade, you would think, in affordable housing, but it's actually a very affordable way to build because we have no floor finish. It's just the slab on grade with polishing. We are hoping at some point to expose some of the oriented strand board from the SIP panels, but that's an option that owners could take or not. And just sort of an illustration of some of the materials. The SIP panels are sort of these roof and wall panels. There's very little stick framing in this house, just a few pieces of wall here and there. And then a large glulam beam that spans the roof so that you can open up the interior entirely if it's not subdivided. These are some of the storage wall components coming in various different sizes to allow different ways of configuring the interiors. We built a ladder to deal with the loft. That's not an aging ready feature by any means, but there is a loft, and so folks who do have the ability to use a ladder have a way to use the loft space, which is mostly just storage and mechanical. Then thinking about, this is a student drawing, thinking about how all these components come together and trying to really think through standard construction, but then how standardized details could become unique and sort of unexpected, but still using very straightforward construction methods. So our goal is to build a catalog of these houses and make them available. We're working with the university, with New Tech, to come up with a licensing agreement that will allow us to share these. And like the Sears catalog of houses from 1926, we'll be doing the 2026 version. And I keep telling people, if the houses look like that, then we haven't really innovated. And amazingly, that's what most houses look like these days. So things don't really change. Although that house for $999 is actually the whole house. It's not just the plans, it's the house. So costs have gone up, but we're still working in ways to control that. So these are the first two houses. We call them Corby and Benson. Last semester, a different group of students. One of the things they were charged with doing was to come up with a range of different house types using the same systems. And so we're going to ultimately expand the catalog to include all of those. Structural insulated panels are 2.5 times stronger than stick framing, and this allows owners to realize long-term energy savings and potentially save up to 55% of the site labor costs due to the speed of assembly for structural insulated panels. And in this image, one item of note is that the bulkhead wall, that framed wall separating spaces, is actually not structural, so that in other instances when we build the Corby house, we could leave that out and let this be one large open space, or include this or other forms of subdivision to change the way the interiors work. The large beam allows us to do that. at the roof, and that supports the building for its entire width. On the exterior of the houses, these are iconic houses with vaguely familiar forms that fit into existing neighborhoods. Though the colors are vibrant, all of these colors exist in the neighborhoods, in surrounding houses. They may be the more vibrant colors in the neighborhood, but we feel that this is part of the way that these houses, although modern, fit into traditional neighborhoods. And you can see here, as construction is progressing, the form of this house is not that different from its immediate neighbor. So our story considers the house as a device for community building and as an active community foundation. For our next project, we're planning to develop a pocket community, or sometimes these are known as cottage courts, by acquiring adjacent lots and splitting them to form a community of 4 to 7 houses with a shared access drive. And we're excited to explore this hybrid using the driveway as a sort of multi-use common area for the neighbors. There's a Dutch term called wooner for a living street, and this is a space that people could really start to use. And so we're excited to start to develop community spaces in this kind of micro neighborhood in the center of a existing community somewhere in the Omaha area. The interiors of these could start to have more common areas, despite the fact that each house would have its own individual property. And we're starting to also work on the landscape for these areas. And for the Corby and Benson development, we developed a kit of parts for the landscape, similar to the kit of parts for the interior of the house, that's designed for adaptability, accessibility, and aging in place. And we're excited to see this as part of the package of the Our Story system as we roll it out. Thinking about how the spaces between buildings become activated, both from an aesthetic standpoint, but also as an amenity for the owners and folks who live there. So I want to conclude again by quoting from the Buell hypothesis. If you change the cultural narratives behind the single-family house, you change the city. Rethinking the house affords opportunities to maintain its relevance and to stake out a middle ground between the isolation and wastefulness of the suburban model and the impersonality of the multifamily complex. We believe that more of all forms of houses are needed to confront the housing crisis, but that the new small house must play an active role in building communities, especially in established neighborhoods. And I'm going to conclude with a quote from Friedrich Kiesler from his unfinished 1940 book, Magic Architecture. The dream house must be neither a castle in the air, a monument to arrogant possessions, a scramble of fashionable styles, nor the sales product of gadgeteering. Contemporary man's home and his town must represent a conquest over technical difficulties with the aim of unfolding the inherent power of imaginative living, and there must no longer be a separation between the world of vision and the world of fact. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting, such impactful work, such an amazing portfolio of work. We're really grateful. We have some time for a few questions before we move into the reception. Becky has the microphone. Oh, someone very excited to ask a question.
Hi, Jeff. Great lecture. I loved what you showed. You know, you mentioned at the beginning about, I think you said like kind of socialized architecture, like why hasn't architecture for the people kind of got more popular through policy or financing or just the aesthetic desire? And it reminded me of Le Corbusier's. He made some big structure in France where all these people were living, and he's like, "You're ruining the inside. You know, you're hanging up sheets and stuff like that." Or Cabrini Green, you know, a big construction for people that was supposed to be affordable housing, and both of those were considered, I think, failures to a certain degree. But your work attempts to do the same thing, but in more realizable chunks. And I think what you said about putting domestic places in neighborhoods that actually elevate it and don't make people say, well, I don't want to live here because I'm in a different class or whatever. And so how do you it comes to then to the kinds of people who are living there. So how do you negotiate like, once people move in, they're going to do whatever they want to with the place, obviously. How do you think about people besides the age, the class, and so forth and so forth? Because big housing has big consequences, and small housing has different kinds of consequences. I think, does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, so like I said at the end, I think the needs of housing have to be met with a lot of different types of housing. It's not just multifamily or, densified single family. We need a wide range. And so planners talk about missing middle housing, which is a range of housing from everything just above the scale and density of a single family house all the way up to the larger complex of multifamily housing. It's that type of housing that's not built very often in the United States these days. So we have single family houses, we have apartment buildings, there's not much in between. And so this project kind of fits into that. It's at the lower end maybe of missing middle, but it's starting to create these sort of cottage courts, pocket communities that have a little bit more density. So I think our goal with these projects was to try to find a way to kind of meet the American dream where it is, but push it a little bit in a direction, but not say you have to live in a 200-unit building necessarily. Some people are going to do that, and some cities require that. But I think those projects could also be built in a very different way. That wasn't where I was taking this talk today, but the project I showed at the beginning is in Iowa, and it's a 45-unit building. And so it's got some common areas, but it's predominantly apartments. And I think it becomes, because of financing, it becomes very different to offer more. Like Le Corbusier's, some of his housing, like the Unité has like an interior street. The idea was to have a social space that everyone would activate through, moving in and out of the housing. And, I don't know, those projects are very popular now. I don't think they necessarily worked back then. But adding personality, I think, is the other side of it, is, the hanging up of the sheets and so on is because the houses were impersonal. And so one of the things we're trying to do is differentiate them through different forms and different materials so that you don't see a development with 100 houses that look exactly the same. So I don't know if that kind of gets at what you're talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a related question, because you had started this talk by saying that Americans have a strange resistance to social housing. So I was wondering if you could talk about the response you've gotten for these ideas, how easy it was to, find residents for the houses that are being built now, and just reflect on how you think this work is really kind of jumping into that conversation.
Yeah, so we've gotten a lot of press from this. There was a recent article in Fast Company magazine about this that is, I think there's something here that's a little bit different. And, Omaha's not always on the forefront, but the folks in the planning office in Omaha were very enthusiastic about what we're doing, because most developers of affordable housing in Omaha are working in the greenfield realm. They'll buy a big piece of land and build a bunch of houses. They might be affordable, but they're way out in the suburbs or places that are less desirable. We're working on infill lots only. They're in the inner parts of the city, the eastern part, which is where the demographic we're trying to work with exists. But finding lots like this one in Benson and adding a little bit of density is something the city is very enthusiastic about, because basically no other developers are doing it. And maybe we're going to fail because they know something we don't. But I think it's really about sort of finding a niche like that and working with it. And like I keep saying, it's not that this is an alternative to. We're not suggesting that social housing, larger scale housing, shouldn't be built. It's just this is something that adds another set of options to the wide range of possibilities for housing. And Omaha is certainly building a lot of apartment buildings, but I don't have a lot of good things to say about many of them, and that's partly due to construction costs and sales and rental rates are not allowing them to use, very many different materials. It's fairly limited to very, very cheap construction, and no one's doing that very creatively right now.
Can you talk about costs? What does one of these houses cost? And
Yeah, so
are there
the-
alliances with government so people can afford them and finance them?
So they're, these two houses are funded, the first two here are funded by Spark, which is an agency in Omaha that distributes the Middle Income Workforce Housing Investment Fund. And that's a forgivable loan. So I think we are spending about $500,000 to develop this whole project. The first house we sold for 190, and the other one, the smaller one, will be probably between 150 and 170 or something like that, which fits exactly where the demographic, the middle income demographic exists. And so the great thing about the Spark loan is that it's $100,000 forgivable for each house. So our challenge is to figure out how we can close that gap so we don't need so much subsidy to be able to build affordable housing. And that's a challenge that any affordable housing developer is struggling with. But there's mechanisms. The Community Land Trust is one way to address that issue. But these appraised at around that rate, so we're selling them kind of where they appraised. And as I said, the first one sold, it pre-sold, and the other one we're going to hold off and market it when it's finished so we can show people.
Thank you for the lecture, Jeff. It's great. I notice there's a lot of the buildings don't have a real soffit or a roof overhang on many edges. Mm-hmm. So do you deal with elements by having a slab, an elevation, or a ground drainage? How do you deal with that in a
we just don't let the houses leak, so it's not a problem. But yeah, there's these two houses have gutters on the edge, but then it's just a flashing over the top. And we just detail it in such a way that it's not going to have an issue. They are concrete slabs, but because of the aging ready aspect of these, they can't be lifted above the grade. So the builders we've talked to are all saying, you got to have it like 3 feet above grade and have steps. We're like, well, we don't have room to have massive ramps, and we don't want steps. So we've been very careful about grading to kind of get a gentle slope away from the houses, but have them be no more than 8 inches above grade, so we can get up and into it without any steps. There's no steps anywhere in these houses.
Thanks, Jeff. I really enjoyed that. I keep thinking about the housing that has shared public spaces outside, and thinking about, I know you're thinking about like a demographic that's based on income, but are you also thinking about like common interests or people that, I don't know, who might buy the houses together? I mean, some of the other work you showed could be like extended family and things like that make a lot of sense. But I'm thinking about the shared public spaces and how you think about, will people use them together?
Yeah, so I'm going to go backwards to this plan. So this is not something we're going to go forward with because someone else got the land, but this is a development we were looking at doing with 4 houses around a shared sort of cottage court style development where there'd be 1 parking stall per house, there's a shared drive, but the driveway is, if it's under 150 feet long, you don't have to deal with fire trucks because they can just run a hose up. So we could actually build it any way we want. We were thinking about that driveway is actually a game court, or it could be used for all sorts of different things, depending on who's living there. So each house has its own little property, but then they all have access to that shared space. So there's the ability to share space if people are so inclined, but they're not forced into a situation where they have to share something. And that was a decision that Jessica wanted to be sure that we could sell this to people who might hate each other, as well as people who love each other, because you never know. So the first 2 houses are they're sitting adjacent to each other, but they're separate properties. They could decide to kind of share and garden together, or they can just say, hey, I've got mine and you got yours, and we will never talk to each other. So that's a possibility. But we want to lean into the outdoor shared space much more in the next version, which will be some version of pocket community like the one I just showed. Well, thanks, Jason. I think it's part of the reason we teach design build studios is to help students understand that what they're making is going to be used by somebody, and they have to think both about how you put something together that's going to be durable and so on, and how it's actually functional. And so I moved to this drawing because it's the only one I have here of what we call, Jason, I think you came up with this term, a design build drawing, where it's a floor plan, but if you look closely, it's got people living in the house, like someone sitting on the sofa, someone sitting in the windowsill, someone entering, but people building the house at the same time. And so it's a way of graphically showing that those two worlds exist sort of simultaneously. Literally they don't, because people aren't going to move in until the house is finished. But for us, thinking about how design impacts living, and the act of design is an act of creating a living space, in the case of housing at least, it's important to think about those activities occurring almost in overlap. And I think it ties into the idea that houses or any building has a life beyond the life of the architect. Architects tend to think of everything as about the great photograph they get at the end of it, and then things change. I've had projects get demolished. I've had projects have additions done by other people. I mean, it's just that they have a life outside of it, and I think having that occur especially in the design studio, that overlap of thinking about making and using at the same time is really critical to imagining how these projects are going to have a life in time. So I don't know if that kind of captures everything, but yeah. Thanks.
Well, please join us across the hallway to continue the conversation, and join me in thanking Professor Day for just a wonderful lecture.
Thanks.